I thought I'd speak on Gideon for these few weeks because of, well, for a number of reasons. One of which was the predicament that he and the children of Israel found themselves in. And one other reason is because he is a lot like us. We know what Gideon was called to do. He was called to lead the children of Israel against the oppressor that came in their days, which was the Midianites. And it was a huge task to be undertaken. And what we find with Gideon is that faith and courage and even commitment was not something which was easy for him. He was insecure, he was uncertain, he was afraid, and he needed constant reassurance. And there are a number of what we would call weaknesses that Gideon had that we can have a lot of empathy with. We are a lot like this man. And so the overall title for this class is that he was made strong out of weakness. And you can see that there on the slide. That's the title of our first class. And you'll recognize those words, brothers and sisters. They come out of the book of Hebrews. And Hebrews mentions Gideon as a man of faith. That despite his weaknesses, he's mentioned there in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32, what more shall I say, for the time would fail to tell of Gideon, and he's the first in this list of, just very briefly, where the apostle here lists some other faithful people, as he's listed people like Abraham and Moses. Gideon is in that group. And I think at the end of verse 34 there that we have on the screen, I think that really summarizes very well what the ministry or the life of Gideon is all about. He was one of the men in this list who were made strong out of weakness. That despite his weaknesses, God made him strong. We find that Gideon is not a typical hero. He's not even a warrior. God commanded him to be a commander of the army against the Midianites. And yet we find him threshing wheat. He seems to be some sort of farmer when we meet him in Judges chapter 6. But God made him mighty in war, and that he could put foreign armies to flight. So that's the main exhortation that we're going to look at when it comes to Gideon the man, brothers and sisters, that he was somebody who had weaknesses that a lot of we frail human beings can have a lot of empathy with. So let's have a look at this section then in the first 10 verses to begin with in our class today. And I want us to have a look at the situation that was prevailing over the Israelites. And it continues that cycle that we know about happens throughout all of the judges, where the people fall into sin. God brings some sort of oppression into their lives, and they learn the lesson. They pray for forgiveness. God forgives them, and the land has rest for a period of time. Well, the exact same thing happens in the days of Gideon. So we start off with learning about the oppression. We're going to learn a little bit more about the sin that was prevailing over them a little bit later on. But it says in verse 1 that the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. Now, we're going to learn, not in this class, but in a later class, and I want us to put this in the back of our minds. Why did God use Midian? I mean, this wasn't just some sort of random nation that God chose. He chose Midian for a reason, that there was going to be something that might twig in people's minds and think, well, why is God bringing the Midianites against us, of all people? But God purposefully chose the Midianites, and there's a period of Israel's history where they interacted with the Midianites, which is going to become very important. And then it says in verse 2, the hand of Midian overpowered Israel. And that's really a key word there. They are absolutely overpowered by Israel. And the people of Israel are just overwhelmed by the situation. It says, because of Midian, the people of Israel made for themselves the dens that are in the mountains and the caves and the strongholds. So the people fled to caves and so forth to hide away from the Midianites. I mean, there are no heroes really in this story, at least early on. Everyone was just fleeing away from this overwhelming force. And we get a sense of the size of that force in the next few verses. So verse 3 says, "For whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. They would encamp against them and devour the produce of the land as far as Gaza and leave no sustenance in Israel, no sheep or ox or donkey. For they would come up with their livestock in the tents. They would come like locusts in number. Both they and their camels could not be counted, so that they laid waste the land as they came in." So leaving no sustenance. And in those days, land and the produce from the land was the economy. This was an agrarian society that relied on their crops. And it's being stripped naked by the Midianites. They are absolutely decimating Israel. They are destroying their economy and suffering as a result. Now, this might be a little bit manufactured, but we might be able to see some parallels with our situation today. So over on, I'm mirrored over on that side. I got to point the opposite way on my slide here. So we have here a summary of the story of Gideon, where the Midianites come and they overwhelm the people. The people hide themselves in dens. Then the crops, as we've seen, are destroyed by the Midianites. But what we're going to see is that in the victory over the Midianites, it all points forward to the return of the Lord Jesus Christ and the defeat of the aggressor against Israel when Jesus returns. And there's going to be a lot of fulfillment of prophecy that is going to happen, or a typical fulfillment of prophecy to do with the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. So obviously today we're going through a little bit of a similar time. We have a virus, which would be our enemy, which has come and has caused us to flee to our caves, to flee to our homes, and to take refuge in our homes. And one of the things that this virus is doing, of course, is causing economic distress. People are losing their jobs. The economies in many countries are tanking, and there's a lot of worry about what's going to happen as time goes forward. But whether this is a sign of the times or not, we don't know. But we do know that eventually things are going to lead up to the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. And things like Armageddon, which is what the story of Gideon points forward to. So perhaps then we can see some parallels with our day. Now, I just want to get rid of this background. Have a look at verse 6. So Judges chapter 6, verse 6. It says that Israel was brought very low. If you're using the King James, I think it says there that they were impoverished. Okay? They were brought very low because of Midian. So we get a little idea here in this word very low of the mental state of the people at this time. They are depressed. They are at the bottom of a pit, as it were, psychologically speaking. So Israel brought, Midian brought Israel very low. And look what the people do. The people of Israel cried out for help to Yahweh. Now there's a little Bible echo there, and we're going to see a lot of echoes back to the Exodus of Israel. And one of the things that Gideon is going to be called to do is really to be a second Moses, as it were. He's going to be called to take Israel on a second Exodus. And the oppressor is different, but the circumstances are very similar. They were brought very low in the time of the Exodus due to the taskmasters and their slavery in Egypt. And there, the people of Israel, in the days of Egypt, they cried out to Yahweh. So there's an echo then with Exodus chapter 2, that during those days, in the time of the Exodus, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry from rescue from slavery came up to God. So just keep that echo again in the back of your minds, and we'll have a look at quite a lot of connections between Gideon and the time of the Exodus. There are connections between him and Moses and him and Aaron that we're going to draw out. And I think Gideon is going to catch on to this echo himself. He realizes that he is being called to be a Moses to the children of Israel. Now let's focus in on, again, back in verse 6 there, where it says Israel was brought very low. Now that particular word is something I want to get into a little bit here. It is the Hebrew word dalal there. And it's a very unusual word. There are only 8 occurrences of this word in the entire Bible. The root is the word dal, which has the idea of the poor and the needy. So that's why we got on that screen. That's the sort of situation that people feel like they're in. That image sort of portrays the circumstances of the people in the days of Gideon. There is poverty, there is distress, there is ruin of the land. The crops have failed, or at least the crops have been taken by the Midianites, and everything has gone really, really bad. Now, I want to have a look at one of these Psalms. We're not going to look at Psalm 79, but I do want to look at Psalm 142. So if you want to open up at Psalm 142, and this same word dalal is used there, and it's to do with the life of David. So this is a psalm that David wrote when he was very low, when he was in this mental situation where he felt a lot like how the people would have felt in the days of Gideon. So if you look at the title of Psalm 142, it says, "A maskil of David when he was in the cave." And I believe that was in the cave of Adullam. He's on the run from Saul. It's just after the situation where he's gone to Abiathar the priest, who's given him the showbread. And we know that Doeg the Edomite was overhearing the conversation. He told Saul where David was. Saul comes and he slays 80 priests of Yahweh. And so this period of time is absolutely desperate in the life of David, and he flees to a cave. And in that cave, brothers and sisters, I think that David thought about Gideon. And he took heart from the story of Gideon, that out of the weakness that he feels in this situation, God would make him strong. So if you look in Psalm 142 here in verse 1, it says, "With my voice I cry out to Yahweh." So exactly what happened in the days of Gideon, exactly what happened in the days of the Exodus. So he is crying out for help. "With my voice I plead for mercy to the Lord." Verse 2, "I pour out my complaints before him. I tell my trouble before him." So this is a man very much in distress. Now, brothers and sisters, are you anything like that? Do you ever complain to God? I mean, we think about complaining to God as something which is maybe sounds a little bit irreverent, but that's exactly what David is doing here. And a number of people in Scripture, they pour out their complaints to God. They groan to God. They don't know the way out of their situation. They feel desperate. And perhaps we've had times in our lives, brothers and sisters, where we felt like that we've fallen into some sort of pit, either of our own devising through our sin or just through the circumstances of life. Perhaps that's how we feel right now with this virus. Perhaps we feel very anxious that we don't see any way out of this situation. It keeps going on and on and on, and we're afraid, we're uncertain what's going to happen. And it's in times like this that we do tend to cry out to the Lord and pour out our complaint before him. And then it says in verse 3, "When my spirit faints within me, you know my way. In the path where I walk, they have hidden a trap for me." So his spirit faints within it. The word faints there is the idea of being overwhelmed. Do you ever get that feeling, brothers and sisters, where just everything is just too much? You just feel completely overwhelmed. It feels like that these waves are just crashing over you, and you can't see any way out of the situation. Well, that's how David felt at this point. He is overwhelmed. That's how the people felt in the days of Gideon. They were overwhelmed. They had lost all confidence. They were at their wits' end. And it's in that situation then that God is going to make the people in the days of Gideon to be strong. So if we carry on here in Psalm 142, it says in verse 4, look how David feels at this point. Look to the right and see, there is none who takes notice of me. No refuge remains to me. No one cares for my soul. And again, do you ever feel like that, brothers and sisters? And sometimes we can get into this state of mind where we feel so overwhelmed with life that our spirit faints within us, that we feel so down in the dumps and so spiritually weak that we think nobody cares for us. That's how David felt at this point. Look what he says. Nobody cares about me. I know I've had times in my life like that where I just feel like everyone's abandoned me, God has abandoned me, and I'm just totally overwhelmed by the situation. But the psalm carries on in verse 5. I cry to you, O Lord. I say, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living. So he still, despite this feeling of weakness, he still clings onto God. And of course, that's the important thing, isn't it, brothers and sisters? When we do feel like this, when we do feel anxious and depressed and very low, cling onto God, no matter how weak you feel. Understand that God is our refuge. Verse 6, attend to my cry, for I am brought very low. That's that word dalal, that idea of being destitute, poor, needy, and so forth. So he's feeling exactly how the people felt in the days of Gideon. And he says at the end of verse 6, deliver me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. So this is the man after God's own heart. This is the man who slew Goliath. So he had dealt with giants in his life. He had reason to have faith. And of course, he was a man of faith, brothers and sisters. But despite that history that he'd had, right now, he feels weak, spiritually weak, physically weak, emotionally weak. My persecutors are too strong for me. And that's how the people felt in the days of Gideon. The Midianites, absolutely too strong for them to cope with. So they fled to their caves. And then he prays in verse 7, bring me out of prison. Now, he wasn't in a literal prison. I mean, he's in a cave, he's hiding, but he can get out of there. But I think more that's, brothers and sisters, a state of mind we can get into in which we imprison ourselves in this psyche, in the anxiety and the depression that we can feel when we are overwhelmed by life. We imprison ourselves, and we feel as if the four walls around us are getting closer and closer, and we're enclosed in, and we simply can't get out of the situation. So bring me out of the prison, he says in verse 7, that I may give thanks to your name. And then David, being the man of faith that he is, clinging on to his faith, he ends by saying, the righteous will surround me, for you will deal bountifully with me. And what we're actually going to see is that is exactly what did happen to David. He was wrong what he said in verse 4. People did care about him. He was not alone. And people did begin to surround him. And we're going to see that in a moment. So I think then that David was thinking about Gideon in the cave. Now, come back with me to Judges and chapter 6. We're going to see how Gideon is a man who has that same sort of spirit. He is uncertain. He's a very insecure man. He doesn't find faith and courage something natural to him. And when he is called to lead the Midianites, He keeps debating back and forth with God, saying, no, I can't do this. What are you talking about? I can't do this. And he keeps needing reassurance. But have a look at chapter 6 here. And I think this is what David would have taken heart from. So what we find Gideon in the first place, hiding, just like the other Israelites are hiding. But Gideon comes out of his hiding place. And look what happens here in chapter 6 and at verse 34. It says, but the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, and they too were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they went up to meet him. Now Gideon for a time felt all alone. Gideon for a time felt weak. Gideon for a time felt completely incapable, overwhelmed himself. But what God is going to do, he's going to pick up Gideon, he's going to encourage him, he's going to reassure him, and he's going to make these men, the Abiezrites and the men from Manasseh and all these other tribes, they are going to come to the side of Gideon, and he's going to become their commander. Now, if we go to 1 Samuel and chapter 22, we can see the historical context of David in that cave. So 1 Samuel chapter 22. And look what happens here to David. Chapter 21 is that the occasion was Doeg the Edomite and the killing of the priests and so forth. Oh, I mean 2 Samuel. That's why I didn't look right. Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 22. Now in verse 1, it says, David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam, which is the background then of Psalm 142. So he's in this self-made prison. But look what it says in the rest of the verse. So in between the first sentence in verse 1 and the second sentence, David pens Psalm 142. And then it says, when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. So just like Gideon's family and his tribe and so forth flocked to the side of Gideon, that's what happened to David too. And so it says in verse 2, and everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul, gathered to him, and he became captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men, about the size of Gideon's army. His army eventually was whittled down to 300 men. So David experiences what Gideon experienced. He was feeling alone, but God provided him with the strength here of an ecclesia that flocked to his side, and he became their captain. However, it's still a bit of a motley crew, isn't it? But look at the sort of people that flocked to David. The sort of people, brothers and sisters, that have empathy with this man. Everyone who is in distress, it says there in verse 2. The idea behind the Hebrew word distress there, it's often used in the context of a siege. So when the children of Israel were besieged in the city of Jerusalem, they were in distress. So these are people who feel like they have been besieged by problems, besieged by situations in their lives that they cannot control, besieged by their own sin, their own mortality. So that's the sort of people here that are gathered to David. And everyone who was in debt, it says. So these are people who are suffering from financial hardship, from economic distress, and everyone who was bitter in soul. Now that word bitter there is used to describe a number of people in Scripture. It's used to describe people who have the problem of infertility, those who are experiencing family turmoil, those who are experiencing the exploitation of minority peoples, personal suffering and hardship, hostile and precarious situations, grief over the apostasy of believers, the Lord's judgment on unbelievers, discontentment with lackluster leadership, the very thought of death itself, and the crumbling of dreams and aspirations. All of those situations are described in Scripture as producing a bitterness of soul. So this is quite the crew then that gathers to David. These are not heroes of faith. These are not people who are waltzing through life and finding things easy. These are people with real problems. Problems often of their own making, but problems all the same. And they go to David and try to find somebody in David who can lead them out of the distress, the anxiety and the depression and the feeling of being very low that had come over all of them. And that's exactly what David became for them. And that's exactly what Gideon becomes for the people in his day. Now, if you turn over to chapter 23, just to continue with this theme that David is thinking about Gideon. He's using Gideon here really as his example as he goes through similar sort of situations. So over in chapter 23, David, again, on the run from Saul. It's not as if his problems just disappear. It's the same old problem. But David now has learned a lesson. He's thinking about Gideon. Now, one of the things that we're going to learn about Gideon is that God kept on reassuring him by providing him with signs. One of the most famous incidents in the life of Gideon, for example, is the sign of the fleece. He puts out the fleece and it becomes wet with the dew. And Gideon asks for this sign. Now, there's multiple signs in the life of Gideon. There's at least 4 times where God provides Gideon with a sign. Not just once. It wasn't just that God provided Gideon with a sign and Gideon was reassured, and then Gideon could just carry on in faith. God was patient with Gideon. He realized he needed reassurance over and over and over again. And we're sometimes like that, brothers and sisters. Well, we have this crest of a spiritual wave sometimes, and we feel spiritually strengthened, but then it wanes again and it goes down, and God needs to pick us up again and encourage us again, and we feel reassured, and then we go down again, and we have these ups and downs, these spiritual highs and lows in our lives. Well, that's what Gideon experienced, and that's what David experienced. Now, in chapter 23, look what David keeps on doing here. So verse 1 of chapter 23. It says, "Now they told David, behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah, and they're robbing the threshing floors." So they're doing a very similar thing to what the Midianites did in the days of Gideon. They're coming against the produce of the land. The Philistines here are robbing the threshing floors. Therefore, verse 2, what did David do? He inquired of the Lord. "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" And the Lord said to David, "Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah." Now, what David does is he keeps on asking God questions over and over again. Now, God doesn't get impatient with David. He keeps reassuring him, as he is going to do, as we'll see with Gideon. Verse 3, "But David's men said to him, behold, we are afraid here in Judah." So it's not as if this reassurance from God has taken away the fear and given everyone courage. No, they are still afraid of the situation, despite the fact that God has given them a sign. They know that God is with them, but they're still afraid. "So we're still afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines?" Then David inquired of the Lord again. And the Lord answered him, "Arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand." So God reassures David again. He's unsure of the situation at first. He asks for the sign. God says, yes, you will defeat the Philistines. But then David asks again. And God says, very encouragingly, very positively, "Arise, go down to Keilah. I will give the Philistines into your hand." Verse 5, "And David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines and brought away their livestock and struck them with a great blow. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah." And God obviously was true to his word. And then in verse 6, when Abiathar, the son of Ahimelech, had fled to David to Keilah, he had come down with an ephod in his hand. Now, what was the ephod for? That was part of the high priest's clothing, which contained within it the breastplate of judgment that had the Urim and the Thummim. This was the way in which the high priest inquired of Yahweh, and signs were obtained from God by use of the ephod. So still this theme of getting signs is in the life of David here. And we're going to see the ephod crop up in the life of Gideon too. Verse 7. Now it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, and Saul said, God has given it into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. So David again finds himself in a prison. Saul, verse 6, summoned all the people to war to go down to Keilah to besiege David. So here is David feeling that sense of distress, being besieged. And his men, verse 9, David knew that Saul was plotting harm against him, and he said to Abiathar the priest, bring the ephod here. So again, David needs reassurance. Verse 10, then said David, O Yahweh God of Israel, your servant has surely heard that Saul seeks to come to Keilah to destroy the city on my account. Will the men of Keilah surrender me into his hand? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? O Lord God of Israel, please tell your servant. And the Lord said, he will come down. Then David said, will the men of Keilah surrender me and my men into the hand of Saul? And the Lord said, they will surrender you. Then David and his men, who were about 600, arose and departed from Keilah, and they went wherever they could go. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he gave up the expedition. So God saves David and his men out of the situation. So David, in all that back and forth in which he's afraid for 1 minute, gets reassurance, needs more reassurance, he's picking up on the example here of Gideon. So let's go back then to Judges chapter 6. So back here in Judges chapter 6, we left in verse 6 there, where we have this echo with the Exodus. The people cry to Yahweh, just as has happened in the time when they were in Egypt. So how does God respond to the cry? Well, he sends a prophet. Verse 7, when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord on account of the Midianites, the Lord sent a prophet to the people of Israel, and he said to them, and what the prophet is going to do is he's going to remind them of the Exodus. He's going to remind them of a time when God, by his mighty hand, took them out of the hands of the oppressor. So they should have taken faith from that. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I led you from Egypt and brought you out of the house of bondage. Verse 9, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out from before you, and gave you their land. This is what I did to your forefathers. And then in verse 10, here's the key for the children of Israel. And he said, I am Yahweh your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice. And what we're going to see, brothers and sisters, and this is, of course, a common theme that runs through Judges and through the history of the children of Israel, is that one of the reasons why, the main reason why God sent the Midianites into their land to oppress them and to discipline them and to sort of get them out of the situation that they had gotten themselves into, which was idolatry. And what Gideon is going to have to do, brothers and sisters, he's going to win, eventually he's going to win this big battle over the Midianites. He's going to gather together his army, he's going to be the captain over them. God is going to make him strong to defeat the Midianites. But before all that, brothers and sisters, what Gideon has to do is remove idolatry from Israel. And what we find is that there was an idol right in the house of Gideon's father, Joash. And that's often a problem in our own lives, brothers and sisters, that we have thorns in our sides. That's how the the gods of the nations are very much often described in Scripture as thorns in the sides of Israel. If we don't deal with idolatry, they become a thorn, they become a weed. And we need to do that spiritual weeding and get rid of those idols that can crowd out our devotion to Yahweh. And that's exactly what Gideon is going to have to do. Then what happens? The prophet goes off the scene, and then God sends an angel. That's what we get in verse 11. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth of Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. So here is Gideon then hiding away from the Midianites, and an angel appears to him. Now, what we're going to see, brothers and sisters, is that this angel is absolutely fascinating. Every single aspect of this angel is important. The fact he is an angel, the fact that he's sitting, note that, he's not standing, he's sitting, and he's sitting under a terebinth, that's important. And everything he says to Gideon is important. And even the staff in his hand is important. It's actually a walking stick that this angel has. Now, why an angel would ever need a walking stick, I don't know. But we're going to see how important all of these things are. So this angel then appears to Gideon. And what the angel is going to do, having had the Exodus reintroduced to them, he is going to speak to Gideon just like the angel spoke to Moses. And he's going to give him a very similar mission, that he's going to lead his people out of bondage. So Gideon is going to become then the second Moses. So I think Gideon picked up on this immediately. But he recognized that this angel, although he didn't realize he was an angel at first, but he recognizes the echo with Moses and the call of Moses. So let's go to that call in Exodus chapter 1. So very, very famous incident in Exodus 3, where Moses comes to the burning bush. If you've still got a marker open in Judges 6, by the way, we forgot to read this verse. Verse 12 of Judges 6 says the following. So verse 11 says the angel appears to him. Then verse 12, it says the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." It's the first thing that comes out of the lips of the angel. Yahweh is with you. Now this, I think, is the echo that Gideon had back to Exodus chapter 3. Because that's exactly what the angel says to Moses at the burning bush. So we get in verse 1 of Exodus 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. Interesting that Moses comes from Midian. And led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. So he has an angelic experience just like Gideon. It says in verse 7, Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry. That's the cry at the end of verse chapter 2, that we had the slide up earlier about the cry that comes. So I've heard their cry because of the taskmasters. I know their sufferings. Verse 8, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me. I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Similar scene then to the Midianites oppressing Israel. Verse 10, Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And this is the jaw-dropping moment for Moses, who's this shepherd, being asked to be a commander of this people. Moses is going to be the one to bring them out of bondage. Now, what we have in chapter 3 is this back and forth now between Moses and God, where Moses says, what on earth are you talking about? I'm going to bring the people out of bondage. And Moses objects to this over and over again. But verse 12, what we notice in the context is that every time that Moses objects, God answers with encouragement. So verse 12, he said, despite what Moses says, verse 12, he said, but I will be with you. That's what the angel says to Gideon. First thing he says, Yahweh is with you, as he was with Moses. I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. And Moses, just like Gideon, is somebody who needs signs. God recognizes this. God recognizes that faith and courage are not natural things to Moses, and that he needs reassurance. So without Moses even having to ask, God says, I will give you a sign. Now, the sign in verse 12 is interesting. We're going to come to this next week. The sign that I have sent you, when you have brought this people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So the sign, the initial sign for Moses, there's going to be other signs, is that he's going to bring them back to this mountain and they're going to worship God. But look at Moses' response then in verse 13. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? So Moses responds, and a lot of it might seem a little bit like delay tactics, maybe, that Moses is unsure of this mission. And he doesn't just like go for it and say, yes, I am faithful and I'm going to go ahead and do this. He struggles with this task. Now, before we go over to chapter 4, where we get more of the conversation with the angel, if you look at the end of chapter 3, there's another little echo here with Gideon. It says in chapter 3 and verse 21, and I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and when you go, you shall not go empty, but each woman shall ask of her neighbor, and any woman who lives in her house, for silver and gold jewelry, and for clothing, you shall put them on your sons and your daughters, so you shall plunder the Egyptians. So God says, you're not just going to win the victory over Egypt, you are going to plunder the Egyptians. Now that is going to happen also in the days of Gideon. So in Judges chapter 8, after they win the victory over the Midianites, it says in chapter 8, verse 26 of Judges, the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, beside the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, and beside the collars that were around the necks of their camels. So they plunder the Midianites in the days of Gideon. And there are a whole slew of other connections that we're going to see. Now, if we go over to chapter 4 of Exodus, Moses now answers God. He's been called, and it says in verse 1, Moses answered, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, Yahweh did not appear to you. So here is Moses being insecure, unsure, lacking confidence in his own ability, feeling weak, not capable of doing what God has asked him to do. Maybe a sentiment that a lot of us feel when God asks us to do things. But what God does is reassure Moses. Verse 2, Yahweh said to him, what is that in your hand? He said, a staff. And he said, throw it to the ground. So he threw it to the ground, it became a serpent. So here is God, again, giving signs to Moses. And we know these are the more famous signs. The sign of throwing the staff and it becomes a serpent, and then putting his hand into his bosom and it comes out leprous, and putting it back and it comes out clean. You know, these are the miracles, the signs that God gave to Moses to convince Moses and to convince the people that he was worth listening to. So here is God encouraging him. But he keeps on debating with God. Verse 10. But Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue." What does God answer to that? Verse 11. Then the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, Yahweh?" And that's something we need to get into our heads, brothers and sisters. When we become coy and diffident and unsure with what God has called us to do, God is on our side. The creator of what he says to Moses here, the creator of your tongue, for instance, God created your tongue. And if God asks you to preach his message, you can do it because God created your tongue and God is with you. So that's the encouragement that God gives us. Verse 12, so then he encourages Moses, "Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." And then Moses answers again. And this is the thing about this man Moses. I mean, he's so much like us. Verse 13, but he said, "Oh my Lord, please send someone else." I mean, you think of Moses as this absolute hero of faith. And of course, that's eventually what he became. But he started off so weak, brothers and sisters, so unsure, so lacking in any confidence that he had. But it was out of that weakness that God makes Moses strong. And so the anger of the Lord was kindled in verse 14 against Moses. He said, "Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite?" So God condescends to this weakness of Moses. He says, "Okay, I know you're weak. I know you feel incapable. I'll give you some extra help. I'll give you Aaron, who will go with you, and he will speak on your behalf." Now, what we're going to see with Gideon later on, brothers and sisters, in our next class especially, is that Gideon, in being called by God, is thinking about both Moses and Aaron. He realized that Moses and Aaron were a team. And Gideon has all of these things going through his mind. I've been called to lead the children of Israel out of bondage, just like in the days of the Exodus. And I need to think now like Moses. I need to think like Aaron. We're going to see the cogwheels turning in the mind of Gideon as he ponders the example of both Moses and Aaron. So let's go back to Judges and chapter 6. So in verse, now have a look at this conversation now between the angel and Gideon. First thing out of the angel's mouth in verse 12, "Yahweh is with you, O mighty man of valor." I mean, what a thing to say to this, at the moment, spiritual weakling hiding away from the Midianites. He says, "O mighty man of valor." There's the confidence that God had in Gideon, despite how Gideon felt. Verse 13, and Gideon said to him, "Please, sir, if Yahweh is with us," so he's questioning this, isn't he? He's questioning whether Yahweh really is with them. "If Yahweh is with us, then why has all this happened to us?" Do you ever feel like that? Why me? Why is this happening in my life? If God is truly with me, why do I have to suffer? It's a very common human sentiment. And look what it says halfway through this verse 13, "and where are all his wonderful deeds?" That word deeds is the word translated wonders in the time of the Exodus. You know, all the wonders and the miracles that were performed. And what Gideon is asking here is, if you're asking me to be a second Moses, if you're asking me to bring the children of Israel out of this bondage, then where are all the miracles? Where are the plagues of Egypt? Where's the crossing the Red Sea and all this stuff? There's nothing. Instead, we're destitute. We've been brought very low. So he's debating now with this angel. The end of verse 13. Did not Yahweh bring us from Egypt? But now Yahweh has forsaken us and given us into the hand of Midian. So he thinks that God has just completely left them. Now look at the response in verse 14. And Yahweh turned to him and said, go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do not I send you? I mean, what a response for the angel. I mean, Gideon is making all of these accusations about God forsaking them, and where are all these miracles? And he gives this very grumpy answer. There's a very negative answer to the angel, but the angel answers him as if he completely ignored what Gideon said. Go in this might of yours and save Israel. All the angel ever does here, brothers and sisters, is encourage Gideon. And that's a lesson for us, brothers and sisters. That's what God does for us. Even if we're at the lowest of the low, what God does in his word is he keeps on encouraging us. And it's a good lesson for our interactions with each other too. When we come across a friend or a spouse or someone in a meeting who is insecure and unsure, be encouraging to them. Don't tell them off, just be encouraging. Now, in verse 17, he even quotes from Moses. So he's caught right on to what the angel is asking him to do here. So verse 17, it says, he said to the angel, if now I have found favor in your eyes, then show me a sign that it is you who talks with me. Now, that's almost word for word what Moses said to the angel later on. Keep a marker in Judges 6. We'll return to this in a moment to finish our class. But turn to Exodus, back to Exodus, in chapter 33. Now, here, Moses is dealing with a people who have just been, having come out of Egypt. He's brought them to the mountain. And what do they do in chapter 32? They're worshipping a golden calf. They've fallen right back into idolatry. So he's really dealing with some things here. And in chapter 33, we find that Moses' personality really hasn't changed. Despite everything that's happened, all the plagues and crossing the Red Sea and everything, Moses is still somebody who keeps needing reassurance from God. So in chapter 33 here in verse 12, Moses said to Yahweh, see, you say to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. Now therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, that's what Gideon quotes, please show me now your ways. Gideon said, please show me a sign, that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight. And what does God respond with in verse 14? My presence will go with you. I will give you rest. Moses comes back in verse 15. He said to him, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight and your people? Is it not in your going with us so that we are distinct? And then in verse 17, Yahweh said to Moses, this very thing that you have spoken, I will do. And just like with Gideon, in this interchange, in which Moses keeps debating with God and needing reassurance, all that the angel does is give him the reassurance he needs. He shows him the signs and he encourages him. Now, come back with me then to Judges chapter 6. And let's just finish off this conversation. So we left in Judges chapter 6 here in verse 14, where the angel says to him, go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do not I send you? Look what he says then in verse 15. And he said to him, please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest. By the way, that's the word dal. Remember that word dalal, which is the same word very low in verse 5. This is the root. So he's feeling very low about his situation in life. My clan is the weakest in Manasseh. I'm the least in my father's house. Very diffident about his ability. Verse 16. How does the angel respond? And Yahweh said to him, but I will be with you. Again, quoting the angel back in Exodus 3. I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man. He doesn't say to him, this is going to be a tough battle. You're going to need to have your wits about you, gather together all your ire and train your soldiers. No, he says, this is as good as done. You're going to defeat the Midianites, who are like locusts in number. You're going to defeat them as one man. So we can summarize this conversation. It's quite an amazing conversation when you look at it. And here it is. And I seem to be in the way. So I'm just going to get out of the way, and you can see that. So I can't read my screen from back here, so I'm going to have to come back into focus. So verse 11. This is all backwards. I knew that this is an interesting experiment. How do I do this? This is all backwards to me. All right, so verse 11, he's hiding from the Midianites. And the angel says, the Lord is with you, verse 12. I won't point. How about that? Verse 13, he says, we are forsaken by God. Verse 14, the angel comes back and says, go in this your might. Verse 15, he says, I am weak. Verse 16, the angel says, I will be with you. Then in verse 17, he says, I need a sign. And even after this whole conversation, Gideon still says, show me a sign. And that's what we're going to come and have a look at, God willing, in our class next week. Because that's exactly what the angel does. What God, through the angel, does for Gideon is he is going to show him a sign. And not just that sign. He's going to show him another sign at the end of chapter 6. Gideon asks for another sign. Instead of God being angry with Gideon, God says, okay, I'll show you another sign. And then he does the sign once, and Gideon says, now show the sign again. And God says, okay, sure, I'll do the sign again. And then in chapter 7, we're going to see that God gives Gideon a sign without Gideon even needing to ask for a sign. So God understands, brothers and sisters. He understood Gideon. He understood Moses. He understood David. And, brothers and sisters, he understands us. And when we feel insecure, when we feel uncertain, lacking in confidence, when we feel afraid, maybe we're afraid of this situation, when we feel anxious and depressed, and then we think to ourselves, why am I feeling like this? Why don't I have faith? Well, we've seen in the example of David, Gideon, Moses, and there are others, brothers and sisters, that these men and women were weak, just like we are weak. And God was patient with them. He listened to them. He kept on giving them reassurance. He kept on encouraging them. So hopefully, brothers and sisters, that's a good place to leave our first class, and just to let that mull over in our minds during the next week, that if we feel very low, God understands. And if we cry out to him, he will encourage us.